Although our speakers today are separated by thousands of miles, and amongst many other things, their work reflects on our relationship to Wales, both historically and at present, and in relation to place and its entanglement with past, present, and future. Mhairi Killin is a multidisciplinary artist who lives on the Isle of Iona in the Inner Hebrides of Scotland, where she works with the precious relationships between land, sea, humans, and other living beings. Bathsheba is a writer and environmental historian specializing in the lands and the seas of the Russian and North American Arctic. Her interest in northern places and cultures began when she was 18 and moved to the village of Old Crow in Yukon, where she trained huskies for several years. From the archive to the dog sled, she is interested in how the histories of people, ideas, and ecologies intersect. And I think that's enough from me, so I'll now hand over to Mhairi and Bathsheba. Thank you so much and welcome.
Thank you very much, Anne, and thank you to the whole project and organisers for inviting Bathsheba and I to speak to each other today. It's I think you can maybe see I'm a bit of a fan, Bathsheba. I have bookmarked your book quite a lot. And I'm really looking forward to talking more with you this afternoon.
Yes, likewise. I'm really grateful for Anne for introducing me to your work, actually. And I'm hoping that this is the precursor to physically coming to Scotland. I still haven't been, so one day soon.
No, well, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, I'd love to. So, I mean, to me, the challenge is figuring out a place to start. I feel like our work has all sorts of overlaps, and the questions that are obviously core to the Center for Energy Ethics, comes up in both of them. But one of the things that struck me, and I'm curious in part how you came to have whales as be kind of part of the work that you do, thinking about cetaceans, and the ways in which in your work they become ways of thinking about the legacies that they carry as kind of a form of witness, essentially, that comes up in your work.
Yeah, so it really begins with a whale carcass. And similarly, I know with your story, when you talk about Floating Coast and the history behind it, you often talk about you often begin with the story of one whale, and that's very much how this project started, Bathsheba. So probably for about the last 10 years, I've been looking at the presence of the military in the Hebrides. And the relationship of that to the social history of the Hebrides. And when a whale came ashore, when a whale carcass came ashore at the north end of Iona in 2018, I was really curious about two things. One, why parts of the whale disappeared quite quickly and were scavenged by islanders, and also what had actually happened to the whale to cause it to come ashore. And what emerged over the next few weeks was that the whale in Iona was just one of many whales that had come ashore around the Hebrides. And there was an investigation underway called by the Scottish Executive because it was a unique mortality event. So there were over 100 whales identified potentially from the same event. In the Inner Hebrides, the west coast of Ireland, Norway, Iceland, the Faroe Isles. So something had happened, and I became curious to try and discover what that was. So that was the start of that unfolding story. Similarly, I know that you talk about in one of the lectures that I watched you gave, you talk about the journey of a bowhead and its calf, and you start the story about that as around the not just the indigenous relationship to bowheads in the Bering States, but also you talk about energy and that transference of energy between the plankton, even the whale's body in death, and then the energies that were ultimately extracted for both capitalism and socialist gain.
Yeah, and I think interestingly, my thinking about whales, I'm trained as a historian. The kind of work I do is grounded in being that and spending, in the case of Floating Coast, this book, spending just an enormous amount of time around piles of very old paper, trying to figure out what happened in the past. And I was initially just interested in the ways in which socialism and capitalism came to inhabit the far north, like what happens when these two ideologies show up there. Never expected to talk about the 19th century, but all of the sources, everything that I was reading in the archives, and every person I was talking to kept saying, no, the real story of the ways in which this very isolated part of the world comes into intense contact with European colonialism is because of whales. And because of whale energy and the ways in which it can be used industrially as well as sort of sustainably. And that's what kind of led me into the story of these bowheads, and then realizing that they are, they're phenomenal animals in a variety of ways, and I think many people find whales to be phenomenal. But one of the things about bowheads that I learned quite early on is that they live an incredibly long time. So I found the case of this one bowhead that was hunted at the end of the 1990s, and was born, at the end of the 1790s, probably. So a 200-year-old whale, a lifespan that far exceeds the ways that humans think about time. And I think that confluence of thinking about how it is that people came to kill these animals so incredibly quickly, and next to that, their incredible capacity for long life and for observation and for, paying attention to the world, that kind of tension interested me.
Yeah, and I found that time as a motif comes up a lot in Floating Coast, and not just the comparative shortness of human lifespan to the lifespan of the bowheads, and also the rapidity with which whaling managed to bring the species to near extinction. So those were very very fast, modern examples of time in the book. But also you talk about the incongruity between indigenous time and the whaling, the time of the whalers. And there's a quote where you talk about not just the whaling, but then we go on to there's mining, there's domestication of reindeer on the US side as another market product, and then there's the Bolsheviks and Chukotka on the Russian side, with the need for whales for part of Stalin's plan eventually. But you talk about they, as in they came to make energy predictable and enclosed space. They also came to make Beringia part of a linear, progressive idea of time. And that, my understanding was that linear time, in opposition to cyclical time, also did one other really important thing, which is it denied the life and death cycle. Mm-hmm. And I found that really fascinating that you reveal that in the book, the relationship between the denial of death. It's concealed in the slaughterhouse of the whalers, and then we consume, or we were consuming the products of the whales in total denial of that life cycle, and therefore in total denial of that circular concept of time.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I find sort of troubling as a modern human person is that so many of the things that I need in order to stay alive, in a very basic sense, right? The food that I need to eat, the fact that it's cold outside here, so I need something to keep me warm. All of those are things that come out of an environment somewhere. And I have very little ability now to know where they come from, right? I'm very disarticulated from that. And that is connected to a sense that I should be able to kind of consume whatever I want to, wherever I want to, in whatever quantity I want to. And part of what interested me in thinking about the Bering Strait is that it's a place that when you spend time in these far northern environments, those kinds of assumptions that you should just be able to get more all the time are kind of false on just in a very practical sense, right? It doesn't work very well there. And so I was interested to see where this idea of kind of limitless growth and just being able to sort of sojourn onto the horizon without paying attention to where what we consume comes from and what that costs. Where does it start? How early does it end up there? And then in what ways does it work in this ecosystem that does not have easily available fossil fuels, and agriculture is a very difficult, if perhaps impossible thing. And I think one of the things that was really striking to me is how far back that impulse existed in a kind of a capitalist and then later a socialist economy. And not just that it went far back, but also how kind of brutal it is. It's brutal to the animals it's killing. It's brutal to the indigenous societies that it runs into and tries to transform. And it's often brutal to the people on the front lines of doing that transforming too. And that there's a way, part of what I'm concealed from as a modern person is sort of knowing where the fibers I'm wearing were grown. But I'm also very much concealed from knowing where that labor in terms of making the garment comes from too. And that those levels of separation, I think, are linked to how it is that we imagine time in some ways.
And also, sorry, no, you go.
No, go ahead.
No, you mentioned also the human labor element there, and so there's so many things in there that I want to pick up on, because in a sense we are, and I'm picking this wording from a book called "We Are All Whalers," because just for the reasons that you've discussed, Bathsheba. So no, we're not wearing baleen corsets. Clearly, we're not eating margarine with whale in it anymore. But the shipping lanes that bring our products to our markets, and there are so many other challenges in capitalism for the environment that even though whaling is much reduced from the period that you're looking at in the book, we are still causing a great deal of damage. And you mentioned there about the human. So there's a common feature between socialism and the capitalist ideology is also the human element as well as the whale element, and the labor cost, and the also possibly what you revealed through all those hours and hours of study and research in cold environments is also there was a moral cost to some of the early whalers as well. And I think you describe it as the moral wound of the whalers.
Yeah, and I will admit this is maybe bad historian practice, but I didn't start the research on the kind of commercial whaling era in the middle of the 19th century, which is when it arrives up in the Bering Strait. And so by this point, the commercial whalers have pretty much hunted out the whales that are closer to home. They actually, most of those whaling ships start very close to where I am right now in Providence, Rhode Island. The main port is about 20 miles up the road in New Bedford. And so that, these are sailors that have been on incredibly long voyages to get all the way to the Bering Strait. Sometimes they've been at sea for a year by the time they get there. But, I think I went into the research with a slightly jaundiced eye. These are a bunch of people who are just kind of professionally going and slaughtering large sentient animals at scale. And one of the things that really surprised me was the degree to which these whalers were very aware of what they were doing. They were using words like extinction by the end of the 19th century. They understood often in a kind of really intensely intimate way what it meant to kill an animal this large, and an animal with social relationships that were very intense. And, sort of carry that burden with them back to, whatever port they end up calling home at the end of a voyage. And that it was interesting to me because it felt like it existed in contrast to the indigenous whalers, who also have to kill very large sentient animals in order to keep their communities alive. It's fundamental food source for Yupik and Inupiaq communities around the Bering Strait, going back thousands of years and into the present. But that the very careful kind of moral universe that Yupik and Inupiaq whalers operate in allows that moral burden to be lessened and shared. And, they're not trying to eradicate a species. They're not killing at the same scale. And the purpose of a whale death is so clearly to keep your children and your neighbors' children and your grandchildren alive, in a tangible, like, if we don't have a whale, then we don't have life kind of way. And I think in that contrast, you see where the real kind of moral qualms of the commercial whalers come from, right? That they know they're involved in this project of killing, but they also don't have a lot of recourse or people who even recognize what it is that they are, that they're hazarding when they do this work.
And from what I understand, when you looked at the Yupik and the is it Chukchi and Inupiaq relationship to whales and to whaling, that almost that morality was turned on its head, and that they felt and actually believed that the whales were making the moral judgment on the humans. And I wonder if you can just talk a bit about that, how that manifested actually, just not only as a belief system, but also just physically in the presence and the behavior of the whales.
Yeah, and I would be curious if this is something that comes up in older cultures, whaling cultures in the Hebrides too, because obviously whaling doesn't just happen in the Bering Strait. But I think this is a kind of core piece of the kind of moral universe for Indigenous hunters in this area, is to understand that whales and many other animals, and sometimes not just animals, but landforms and the ocean itself, have not just sentience, right? Which I think at this point many people would offer to whales, right? We know they're very intelligent. We know they're able to communicate with each other. But within all of that intelligence, they also have a kind of moral capacity, and are consistently observing people. So if you are a person who is kind of upstanding in your community, and you're good to your elders and you're good to children and you are good to other animals and kind of obey the moral world around you, whales see that. And it is to those hunters that whales will choose to make themselves available to be hunted. And if you're somebody who is terrible within your community, right? You're mean, or you're greedy, or withholding in some way, or mistreat another animal, whales will also see that, and then they will refuse to participate in a hunt. And so in that case, the source of moral judgment is not coming from human minds, right? It's coming from whale minds. And just that power inversion, I think, is a very different way of orienting a person in the universe vis-a-vis the rest of life around us.
Yeah,
is that comes up?
I think, it's difficult to draw comparisons because we don't have an existing Indigenous whaling community in the Hebrides anymore. But we know from the archaeology, particularly a site on Uist called Clachallan, that there was evidence not only of whale use on a domestic level, so obviously bones and in the midden, and lamps that had residue of whale fat and whale oil or whatever for light. But so it was a collection of houses, and there was a high status house on the site, and in the high status house rather. We've got examples of the only mummified bodies that have been found in Europe were found in this high status Bronze Age site on the Hebrides. But what was also in that house was deposits of whale. And the archaeologists think that they were not in the domestic environment, but more in a ritualistic environment. So there clearly was a relationship that went beyond the practical and the domestic. And yeah, I mean, there are similarities, I think, in small coastal, well, they're all coastal communities in the Hebrides, in the Outer Hebrides in particular, obviously, but we can see there are still stories from 16th to the 19th century of opportunistic whale stranding, and clearly that being bounty, it being food and oil and essential for the community and shared out within the community, and also like small scale hunting, maybe like porpoise and dolphin, or animals who were weak or sickly and came into sheltered water that could be hunted easily. So yeah, and there's also something else I noticed that you wrote about, the flesh being sliced very thin, and almost like the whalers thought it was like bacon. And funnily enough, the Gaelic for whale is muchvara, which is sea pig. And it's who knows, it's possible maybe, some people think that's because of the snorting, but who knows, maybe that's because of the bacon. The way it's used in a similar way to bacon. But I think also going back to the similarities between the Hebridean and the Beringian communities perhaps goes back to, again, this idea of time and the understanding of the life-death cycle, which goes at its own pace. So as you talked about the 200-year-old bowhead, whereas the capitalist and socialist time went at a much more accelerated pace, and that influenced both ideologies, this concept of time, and clashed horrifically.
Yeah, right. I don't think it's just in the Arctic that these ideas of time don't mesh with ecological reality, right? I think it looks different in different places perhaps, but that the kind of expectation that the world can keep speeding up. And I think that is often, the shorthand for that, at least in the United States, is often to talk about making things more efficient, right? And that is usually the end goal of a lot of kind of economic interventions, is to increase efficiency, which is usually something to do with making it take less time to do something. And obviously there are places where that is great. Like you want to take less time getting an ambulance to someone's house if they're having a heart attack. This is a very good intervention. But if you're kind of participating in the sort of broader ecological context, and often a human context, that's not how bodies operate, right? We don't speed up after a certain point in our lives, and you can't increase the speed at which a whale grows to be an adult. That just simply takes an enormous amount of time and energy, and kind of letting the whale be a whale. And I think it was one of the surprising commonalities between the ways that the American and Soviet kind of economic systems ended up looking like each other, was this kind of assumption that speed was always good.
No,
go ahead.
No, and if the whalers of both ideologies didn't meet their targets, it was a very punitive situation that they found themselves in, wasn't it?
Right. I mean, the way to be a good whaler is to kind of keep speeding things up. And that, the Soviet system sort of makes this the most explicit because, very famously, Stalin's first 5-year plan is completed in 4 years. So it's like, look, we actually just made time go faster. And there's lots of kind of accounting that goes into doing that. Right. That it also, I think, is part of that labor pressure on many of the people who are working in these very kind of frontline jobs, that that's where the real burden of always doing things more quickly comes from. And I think that remains, to this day. Like if you work in a contemporary slaughterhouse, your expectations are actually very similar.
And I'm wondering how, in the time that you spent within these communities, I'm wondering how you find and how you experience time, Bathsheba, and how did you see where the presumably very deep footprint of colonialism and the legacy of that clashing with the communities who were still trying to live a more pre-colonialism authentic way of life. Did you witness that?
It's a really fascinating experience every time I go back up north. And it looks a little bit different in Russia than it does in the United States, but the ways in which now many people by necessity need to be part of a contemporary workplace, right? They are working for the local government or in a local school, and need some form of income. And those tend to be organized the ways that, like, my job is organized. You go into work in the morning and you leave work in the evening, which of course has nothing to do with how whale migration behavior works. It has nothing to do with when the berry picking is really good. It's just sort of out of sync. It has regulated our lives so that every day looks more or less like the next one. And you might have a weekend here or there. But weekends, of course, also don't line up with when, the berry picking is good or the whales are migrating. So the kind of intense kind of multi-temporal thinking that my friends end up doing about, like, well, how many days off can we get, and can we time it around when we think the caribou are coming through, or should we just quit our job in the fall because we won't be able to do both of them. And I think it's particularly intense for children, because formal education is one of the critical pieces of the colonial apparatus. And so for children to be in school in the kind of regular school day means that they're often not able to participate in the berry picking and the whale hunting. I think that in some places that's starting to change, right? Schools are starting to figure out ways of building curriculums that can be paused and started and integrated into ways of living in the landscape that go back far, far further than 150 years of colonial presence. But yes, there's like a daily tension around time and how we organize it, and should it be really kind of regimented and regulated and run by a clock, or should it be run by the kind of clocks of the world in a more general sense?
By nature's clock. And we still have a legacy of that here, because this part of Scotland, our October school holidays, is a week longer than the October break on the mainland, because of that tradition of the school children being needed for the harvest, basically, and that tradition that's continued. So I really understand what you're saying, and I also imagine that it has shifted value as well, like value onto products that are brought into the area, and as opposed to like buying your food, obviously, rather than hunting for your food, and that then causes the need to earn money and work within a different framework than perhaps your grandparents or your great grandparents had to work in.
Yeah, although I would say people, the most valued food that anybody ever has is if they have wild foods or traditional foods, right? That's it's mostly a question of, can you find enough employment or flexible enough employment that you can house yourself? And, people want to have the things that we enjoy having, like a computer, so we can do this, while also being able to participate in that. So it's not, even like really young kids, if there's fresh whale meat in town, that's what they're eating, and with great joy. So I think it's more the kind of friction between how it is that we choose to arrange our days, right, and the kind of expectations behind that. I actually had a question thinking about one of the things that Anne said at the top about sort of the ways that we think about care and healing and regeneration, and that when you started and we're talking about this whale that people came and you were surprised that bits of it disappeared more quickly than other bits. I'm curious if that is linked to ways of thinking about something regenerative or careful, or curiosity, or how Absolutely. Are those things kind of coming up?
Yeah, no, I think it is, Bathsheba, because I think there is still a buzz when a creature of that size washes ashore on the island, without a doubt. And I think it connects into our primal fascination with whales. So it's about the mythology. It's about the other. It connects us to the otherness of the ocean around us. And I think that at one point you talk about speaking to a Yupik man in Russia who talks about the very, very casually about the world being occupied by whales and by humans, and some might be, but by all beings, by, some beings might be humans, some beings might be walrus, some might be whale. And that reminded me of the Gallic otherworld, which to me has got a bit of a misnomer, because I don't think it was otherly, or I think it was more alongside, it was within, it was part of the same reality. And I think that's when the whale, for me, when the whale came ashore in Iona, it was like a doorway into that, like this other world, which perhaps my ancestors might have been a bit more casual about, certainly a bit more pragmatic, like, here's food, here's oil, but also reverence. And I think it goes back to something that Anne talked about around metaphor, and that it doesn't really matter whether that metaphor is a whale or whether it's the fairies and the Sheehan. It's a way in for us to understand the complexity of reality, and collecting. So what was interesting was, and I'm sure everybody listening to this will be familiar, parts of the whale were collected and nurtured. So that, to me, they weren't, they were cleaned and they were brought into the home, not left in the garden.
Right.
Or on the step outside. They were actually cleaned and brought into the home. So that's something about kin, isn't it? Some sort of deep understanding of kin, or reverence, or knowing that these are exceptional creatures.
Absolutely.